Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, February 25th, and we will be hearing the second part of a two-part series on climate science and planning. This today is the intermediate roundtable. Last week was an introduction, and if you are interested in viewing a recording of last week's introductory session, The Basics, you can head over to our YouTube channel to view that at youtube.com/planningwebcast. And this session will also be recorded. I'll go over that in a moment. If you have any questions, technical issues going on today, you can type those in the questions box in your GoToWebinar tool panel. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those again in your questions box, and we will answer those at the end of our presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are hosted by the Sustainable Communities Division, so thanks to you for hosting. You'll hear a little bit more about them in just a moment, but we are glad to have you here for your Sustainability and Resiliency series. We're glad to have you. Coming up on your screen is a list of some of our upcoming webcasts. You can register for these and all of our sessions by heading over to our website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits. It also fulfills the new Sustainability and Resiliency credit that is now required, and I believe you'll hear about that again in a moment. You can log those credits by heading over to planning.org. You just log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number. Both of those, again, can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And if you're on social media, be sure you like us on Facebook. That's where we post any important date or time changes. I'll also post reminders to register for this week's session. We host sessions just about every Friday. Caveat, actually, we have one coming up on the 9th of, maybe the 9th of March. It is a Wednesday. Yes, it is a Wednesday. And it is the 9th, and it's actually going to be at 10 a.m. This is with the International Division, and we're just trying to support folks that are not stateside and that might have a hard time meeting that 1 p.m. Eastern Time date and time. So be sure to check out all of our upcoming sessions. Like us on Facebook, and as I mentioned, we record all of our sessions and post them to our channel on YouTube. So be sure to subscribe to us so that you get notified when I post up new recordings for you to view. And I should also mention that this session, just like last week's, are available on demand as well, so that you can get your CM credits or your specialized SR credit by viewing this session recording on demand through the end of this year. I think that's it for my housekeeping items. Again, if you have any questions for our panelists today, just type those in your questions box. I'm not ignoring you if I'm not answering them. We just answer them at the end during the Q&A. And if you have any technical issues, be sure to type those in and I'll do my best to help. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Carla. Carla Ebenbach is going to give a quick overview of today. And Carla, I just gave the controls over to you, my dear.
Okay. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. All right. Well, welcome to the Sustainability and Resilience series. I'm Carla Ebenbach. I'm Secretary Treasurer of APA's Sustainable Communities Division and Chair of the Steering Committee for this series. And I'm a principal of Ebenbach Consulting based in Southeast Florida, oriented towards sustainability and resilience policy and planning. I've been AICP certified for 24 years, and I'm also a lead green associate. I've been an active volunteer with APA Sustainable Communities Division and other APA policy development processes for 5 years, and I'm in my 3rd year as SCD's Secretary Treasurer. Today's session will build upon last Friday's foundational instruction on current climate science and its relevance to the planning practice by taking a deeper dive into the subject, and in particular, sharing applications of climate science in the field. First, a little background. The Sustainability and Resilience series was created to provide learning opportunities for planning professionals. For many of you, these terms are familiar, but they are always important to continually revisit and reconsider. So for the purposes of this series, planning for sustainability means balancing social, economic, and environmental resources, incorporating resilience, and linking local actions to regional and global concerns, while planning for resilience means to us supporting the capacity of individuals, communities, and systems to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of chronic stresses and acute shocks, and even transform when conditions require it. The series is offering diverse perspectives under this wide subject matter umbrella over roughly 2 years, aiming to explore 12 topics in formats that cater to both those who are new to the subject matter and those more familiar and experienced. This could result in as many as 24 events by the end of 2024. You can earn, as Christine said, AICP CM credit for either the live or the on-demand version of any series session, and the recordings are becoming a library of resources available at no charge. Already available for viewing on this platform are 2 sessions held in September on extreme weather trends, and today's and last week's sessions will be available there soon as well. And any of these sessions can earn you the new mandatory SNR CM credits specifically as well. A word about that, as you may have heard by now, sustainability and resilience is a new CM requirement for AICP planners, along with equity, as of this year. Any live or on-demand series session here that you attend can earn that SNR credit. And there will likely be plenty of other sources outside the series for earning the credit as well. It's an outgrowth of the work to develop the credit in which I was involved. In the process, our task force became aware of the need for more learning opportunities, and we weren't the only ones to feel that way. Volunteers came out from a whole host of APA divisions to guide this new series with a diverse array of expertise. And we welcome more involvement. So anyone interested in joining our committee or being a speaker in a future webinar, we're seeking planners as well as other professionals and other subject matter experts. Please reach out and I'll be happy to discuss with you. Upcoming sessions are going to get into such topics as the basics of mitigation and adaptation, public health, technology tools, economic strategy, preparedness strategies, policy tools, among others. All is related to sustainability and resilience. All sessions will endeavor to meaningfully examine social equity implications within the presentation and raise the bar for how marginalized communities are embraced in the planning process. So on to the program. Our first presenter today is Caroline Cunningham, who is AICP and CFM, as well as a principal at Stantec. Caroline's going to introduce herself and the subject, and then Katrina Kelly-Pitou of SmithGroup will follow with her presentation. So Caroline, I am going to hand it over to you.
All right, everybody see my screen? Could you confirm, please? We can see it.
Thanks. Okay, so thanks everybody for being here. I'm Caroline Cunningham with Stantec. I'm a principal there, and I serve as our Hazard Mitigation Services Lead and also support our FEMA work as our Deputy Account Manager. I'm a certified professional planner and floodplain manager, and also a trained charrette manager. And I've used those skills to help support more than 200 governmental and private entities to advance resilience through vulnerability assessments, risk communication, hazard mitigation plans, and a range of other work. So also a proud board member of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association, and look forward to talking with you all today. So without further ado, let's get into it. At your presentation last week, for those who were able to catch it, the presenters talked a lot about the difference between weather and climate and also some data trends. So today we want to get more into the drivers of this, as well as how we as planners use climate science within our work at the federal, state, and local levels. So we just get into that. So before, let's just start with some science. Always good to start there. This is a question that I get fairly often in my work is, well, how warm is it? And what does that really mean for us? And what can we do about it type of thing. So if you look, I mean, a few important things to know about temperature is that when we talk about it, it's when you hear these numbers, they're often global averages. So what you see here is coming from the International Panel on Climate Change and their AR6 report. Just talks about, you know, here we are now, we're about 1.1 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. And that is, we're projected to be at about 1.5 by, say, the early 2030s. That can change depending on the interventions that we take to reduce greenhouse gases, for example. But we are clearly seeing impacts now, and those are going to get more severe and pronounced as we move forward, which can have really catastrophic impacts as we get into 2 degrees of warming and higher as our systems start to collapse, like our agriculture systems and our ecosystems, etc. Another good way to visualize this is through a good old-fashioned bell curve. So temperature tends to follow a standard distribution, as you see here. If you look at that top graphic in 1951, you see that, you know, everything's pretty normal. But with climate change and that addition of additional carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it basically shifts that entire bell curve to the right. And what that means is we're not only getting warmer, but we're also seeing a lot more extreme events, as you see in that kind of thickening of the tail of those extreme events there on the right. And what all this translates to is that we're going to start seeing more of these. So the warmer it gets, the more extreme events we see. There's a few little stats there on the bottom of the slide, but we're seeing things really astronomically past this. So for an example, the 2003 heat wave in Europe, which killed tens of thousands of folks, that actually has been calculated to be a 1 in 1 million event that likely wouldn't have been possible without carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere by human activity. So there's a lot of implications that come to this in terms of what that means for our society and what we can do about it. This is clearly a global problem. It's not something that one person can fix. So how does that all get translated at the global level? Enter the Conference of Parties, or the COPs. So I'm sure that you guys have seen some of this. You may be very familiar with it, or maybe this is somewhat new to you. And I won't dive into the 30-year or so history that they have together, but it is important to note, I think, a few of them. Number one, back to that 1.5 degree target. That was signed at the Paris Agreement in 2015. And it's not legally binding, but it was a pact between hundreds, or almost 200 countries, sorry, to basically say, hey, we've got this. We really want to stay. Our target is 1.5, but let's make sure we keep it under 2. Unfortunately, that we're not on track for that, and we are expected to far surpass that at our current rates. So that put a lot of pressure on the Glasgow Pact that happened this past fall. People wanted to see some serious change, some good action take place, and while it was not a failure by any means, it was a bit watered down. So we saw things like phase down the fossil fuels versus phase out the fossil fuels. So again, these are not legally binding, but those who do participate in this and sign the pacts do have some legal responsibilities to be transparent about their emissions and where they are in terms of the Paris Agreement. So in 2023, there will be what they call a global stock take to see what that, how we're actually doing, and that will be the first official stock take of the Paris agreements. And all this starts to, as countries are in these pacts, it does have some implications on what they do, and that becomes drivers. So at the federal level, unfortunately, climate change has become a bit politicized, but our current administration has a very renewed commitment to climate. So net zero by 2050, it's great to see that. There's funding available. So we've had the omnibus appropriation, which put a lot for clean energy, the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So that released something like $65 billion for clean energy, another 50 or so billion for climate adaptation, as well as capitalizing the Storm Act, which hasn't been done yet, but hopefully this all transpires in the future. And we'd love to see, obviously, Build Back Better is not happening, but we would love to see pieces and parts passed from that, because it really had some great pieces to it when it came to climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And then lastly, some executive orders here. 14008 was certainly not just about this. There's lots in there for equity, for disadvantaged communities, for example. But the unique part of it is that the federal agencies were required to complete an adaptation plan for their agency. And that has trickle-down effects. So think about DOT doing that and what it means for like a state or local transportation agency. Then shortly after that, they passed executive order 14057, which said, great, thanks for doing this plans, go ahead and implement them. And it also required that the federal government do a federal sustainability plan. So if you go to sustainability.gov, you can read those plans. They're pretty interesting, as well as see more about the federal sustainability plan. So on the federal level, at least for our government, it's not necessarily driving specific actions holistically, but that may change in the future. But luckily, our state and local governments are doing a lot. And we've seen some really great trends in the past few years. For example, mayors joining in for, mayors for climate, things of that nature. And historically, climate science, the work that I've done, was really specific to things like climate adaptation plans, maybe a progressive hazard mitigation plan, of course, our net zeros and our GHG plans. But that's really shifted in the past few years. And we're seeing climate show up in all kinds of traditional plans like capital improvement planning, master planning, of course, with communication. So it's becoming much more normal and normalized, mainstream, to see climate included into these plans, which is obviously great. And we are going to show you some examples of exactly how that translates into specific plans. And we're going to start at the international level. So kind of what we're doing here is, how does all of this international work that I've talked about, this the COPs, the 2.5, the IPCC, all of that, how does that translate into the work we do locally as planners? So I'm going to start with some international examples, which we'll talk about here, then we'll talk about a national example, and get down to local. And Katrina is really going to focus on the local side. So starting here at the international side, this is, there is work being done at the private sector as well as for governments. And I think the private sectors are a really interesting one to talk about, because we're seeing so many of them have sustainability plans and net zero plans. And if you're a small company, maybe it doesn't make that big of a difference. But if you're a mega company like an Amazon, that can really start to take a bite out of the emissions when not just you as your company are greenifying what you're doing, for example, but also requiring that your vendors be sustainable and be mindful and have set targets around sustainability. This is also largely driven by customer demands, wanting to make sure that they are buying sustainable, as well as boards wanting to make sure that they keep those customers happy and their stocks are even being impacted by it. So quick little case study. There aren't a ton of examples out there in terms of like countries working together. There's certainly some in Europe and some island countries, but There is one between the US and Canada that we worked on that included bridges as well as a number of other assets. And we focused on climate risk. So we were helping them understand in these various different microclimates, how is climate impacting their assets, their operations, their maintenance, their services, and where should they focus their resources so that supply chains were not impacted by climate in the future. So taking this down to our next level, I'm going to share a national example. And this is one of the favorite projects I've ever worked on. So this was a climate resilient strategic plan for our national client with a range of different assets. And their mission to us was, hey, we really want to integrate climate adaptation into everything we're doing, into our plans, our policies, truly everything that they were doing, which is a unique perspective. We see a lot of corporations who want to integrate climate mitigation, so they're focusing on, what should our net zero planning be, et cetera. But the climate adaptation side is a bit more unique. But it was driven by a number of things. They were certainly experiencing losses due to impacts, and they were, projecting billions more if they didn't start to make some very serious adjustments. So we came in and we did some really robust engagement. We brought together departments that don't normally work together, folks from finance, from HR, from engineering, from planning, from operations. And we worked with them to figure out where could we change their processes and the way that they currently operate in order to better consider climate adaptation and reduce the impacts of the future changing climate, future climate events. So that was a very interesting process to be able to figure that out. And we ultimately we created these focus areas of people, practices, and assets. And people, that it really gave us like a way to say, like, okay, let's focus on the people at this meeting and really figure out what are we doing with people. And that ended up being actions for things like, we need to train our staff to make sure that they understand, what we for example, might look for in a proposal or need to put into an RFP as we're bidding out work. Or it also included things like hiring more people so that they had the right knowledge at the table. Practices, that included a lot of things. That was probably the biggest one we had in terms of practices would be things like how they collect data and making sure that was a little bit better. And then also the last one was assets, and that was specifically like how can they adapt or retrofit their existing assets to better absorb those impacts of climate. So some good things came out of this. I think some things that will make this a very actionable plan is that while we did have a lot of actions, we really prioritized kind of a top 10 list or so of those people, practices, and assets. So of those top 10, they have a 3-year timeline to be completed. And we took the time to really flesh those actions out. So we got into, not just let's hire more people, but what does hiring more people entail? Who needs to be involved in that? What sort of skill sets are we looking for? All that was defined during the planning process in order to allow staff to really get their arms around it and be able to take action once we left, once we were no longer there. We were also, we wanted to have measurements of success and the benefits. That was really important for their board to hear. So why should the board, provide money to implement this 3-year plan? And by providing that information, it helped give them the selling points to take to their board to be able to move forward. Moving on to kind of a state level, this was actually a multi-state level. We did a climate vulnerability assessment across like 9 or 10 states, and it looked at a lot of different climate stressors, as you can see here, from extreme heat and wind and sea level rise and precipitation, and then multiple climate scenarios. So looking at different emission scenarios at different timelines, and all that's like really just gearing them up to look at different risk tolerance in terms of how that information is relayed across the organization. However, when you have, there's kind of a few learning lessons working across such a large area. One was data availability. So it was extremely challenging. It was a challenge around consistent data and available data and data that could be, readily used in this analysis. So that was something that it is certainly not unique to this client. We see that with pretty much every client we work with to a degree, but when you start working across a large scale, tons of different asset types, it becomes a lot more complicated to be able to manage all of that. The other thing was because we were looking at, a number of different hazards, a number of different climate scenarios, and a number of different assets, we were sort of exponentially adding to the amount of data that we would not only have to analyze, but figure out what the results were. So it became very critical to have some sort of, spatial analysis capability as well as system to get into the results. And we ended up kind of developing a very basic viewer, as you can see on kind of the bottom here, but that would allow us to say, okay, at this type of assets, how is it being impacted by heat and at what scenario in different years? And we could just sort of plug and play with the different scenarios and answer questions that our clients were having and provide meaningful results. All right, the last example here is it's a local example for the city and county of Honolulu. This is an interesting project. It's climate design guidelines and it's in flight. It's not complete yet. And I think it's really, I wanted to show this as opposed to maybe a mitigation plan or a climate adaptation plan, because this is a space where maybe planners are not typically at the table. And on our project, it's very much engineering, but there are planners there are climate scientists, and there's other experts there to kind of bring this all together. This particular project, the point of it will be as the city continues to develop for its specific project. So when the city is developing a new project, it will go through a process to understand what risk is this new development at. So what hazards might it be impacted by, and to what extent. And based on that, we will there will be, offered a number of guidelines to make sure that climate is considered in the design of that project or development. Planners have a really unique role here because they're able to translate that very complicated information into something that's really usable. So ultimately, it's not the consultant that will be using these design guidelines, it's the city and the city staff, the city and county of Honolulu and their staff. So it's very important that we make it intuitive and user-friendly, and something that everybody can really understand and get behind. And I think as planners, we have a really unique and special role, quite frankly, to be able to do that. Great. So that concludes mine. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Katrina.
Great, thanks so much, Caroline. Hold on one second, I'm just going to pull my slides up. Okay, can everyone see them okay?
Yep.
Fantastic, thanks so much.
And don't forget to put your webcam on. There you are, perfect.
Sorry, there's a little bit of a delay. Thanks for that. Okay. Well, thanks, Caroline, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Katrina Kelly-Pitou, and I'm a systems strategist and a principal of resilient design at SmithGroup. What this means is I'm not a traditional planner, so warning, I won't know all of the nuances of the planning field, but I'm actually an engineer and more of a climate scientist who works alongside planners. That means a lot of my job actually deals a lot with translating a lot of the climate science part that Caroline really laid out so well into really actionable items. We thought it'd be really great today if I could go through and present how you really drill down some of those plans and turn them into a really implementable level. So at the end of the day, a lot of the work that I do is really focused on this quote from the IPCC. It's really about creating transformational change that's going to be happening at all different levels. So this means working with individuals, communities, businesses, and institutions and governments to really redefine two things. And that's really how we go about daily life, but how we're also going about the consumption of resources. A bunch of the work that I do is really working alongside our planners, our design strategists, and really understanding what information is available and how can we make better decisions that lead us to more resilient communities today. So one thing I wanted to point out is that, of course, a lot of this is really complex information, right? It can be really overwhelming to think of all of the different vulnerabilities that communities of different scales are going through. But if you think from a planning perspective, you're already quite used to being able to do this at a lot of different levels, whether it's working with sustainability frameworks that happen across higher education institutions, working with LEED frameworks for even in building and healthcare systems, or even working things like the 2030 districts. One of the things that we're starting to do more and more, and anyone who is working especially with local cities and municipalities, I really encourage you to look at ICLEI, which is the local governmental organization that helps report up to that UN FCCC level. They deal quite a lot with carbon and climate vulnerabilities, but are increasingly looking at things like how energy, waste, water, and resilience can really tie together to help us achieve those goals that Caroline pointed to at the beginning of our presentation today. At the end of the day, what we've really got to do with planners, though, is kind of bring it down to the smallest level and just think about all the scales of influence that we have to have. Depending on what level you're working with, one of the things that I like to do is think about these, what we call the nested scales of influence. If I'm working on a building, I'm trying to think of the neighborhood context. If there's a neighborhood context, I try to think of what the city planning context is, the state plans, the regional goals, the national goals, and the global goals. If you kind of break down those layers of ecosystems, it gets a little bit more tangible to think about how can the plan that I'm doing help to fit within an existing framework. So the case studies that I'm going to go through today are exactly this. They're examples of 3 different scales of interventions that we created for resilience at SmithGroup that really look at how we can connect to existing plans, but also create kind of a bottom-up push for resilience, if you will, in areas that might not have really strong top-down regulations on things like climate. I'm going to be focusing on public sector institutions today, so I'm going to be walking you through what we call the MEDC Resilience Framework. This is for the Economic Development Corporation of the state of Michigan. We're going to be talking about the Las Vegas Resilient Master Plan, which was the city of Las Vegas's 2015 master plan, obviously a city-level government. And then we're actually going to be talking about a utility-based master plan that we've done, which is called the Electrification Strategy for Deep Decarbonization, which we did in partnership with Duquesne Light, our local utility here in the city of Pittsburgh. Each one of these is a different scale of influence, right? One is more of a state level, one is more of a city level, and one is actually more of a local district scale intervention. However, each of these reports, the job was to connect the dots up to the higher level. MEDC was to think about how Michigan's recent climate announcements could fit in with the national goals that we recently released. Las Vegas's master plan was to fit within regional discussions that were specifically happening around water. And Duquesne Light's perspectives were actually thinking about how the utility could help to respond to a lot of the Paris Agreement. Pittsburgh famously ratified the Paris Agreement in 2015, one of the early cities. So they really wanted to be one of the first deregulated utilities to try and understand and identify how can we really equip our citizens and users to be more prepared for the future, but to also be more sustainable today. So the first one I'm going to go through today is the Resilient Michigan Framework. This is a really exciting tool, and I really want to focus on calling it a tool, not a plan, because it's a resource that you can absolutely use. Of course, it's focused on Michigan, but the slide I'll show you at the end of the presentation actually contains almost a library of open source tools that you as planners can go into and really use publicly available data to help understand how you can turn vulnerabilities into opportunities. One of the things that we had to do at MEDC, though, was start talking about what resilience actually meant. For me personally, I've been working in the concept of resilience since 2014 now, actually. I used to work at the UN level, I worked at the national level, worked at the local level, and now I'm at SmithGroup. And I think the number one question or comment that I get is, what does resilience mean? we used to really point, I think, a lot to the UNFCCC definition, and that focused heavily on a climatic perspective. But I think especially the economic and social events that we've gone through in the past couple of years have caused a lot of communities to ask the question, well, how can we incorporate more socioeconomic measures into our planning purposes? Preparedness is more than climate. Preparedness is more than environmental. So how can we think about resilience? Whenever we started defining it for Michigan, we focused on actually developing this conceptual graph, if you will. Resilience was really about preparing any sort of response, if you will. It was really making sure that if any sort of disaster, any unanticipated event happened to a community within the state of Michigan, then the city needed a variety of preparedness levels to make sure that they were able to bounce back. If we think of resilience as being prepared to handle the unanticipated, this was really at the heart of the Michigan plan. We did a lot of benchmarking for the state of Michigan to understand what type of resources were out there. And it really is great, I think, from a resilience perspective, to look and to see what other cities, states, and other nations have done. Caroline showed a lot of wealth of resources at the beginning that give different examples. But of course, whenever you dig down into the city level, I'm biased because I work on cities a lot, they're really fun to look at. So I encourage you to zoom out too and look at what other cities in different countries have done. Some of the most impressive plans that we've seen have come out of New Zealand specifically. A lot of plans have also come out of more Asian Pacific communities. So there's a lot of really cool resources out there that you can help to think, how can I translate this into my own city or community? At the end of the day, we really came across this concrete understanding of what resilience needed to mean for the state of Michigan. As a planner, you'll see that this is where the planner's perspective really came in. Well, I really wanted to focus on how to bring engineering systems back to life, how to bring infrastructure back to life, even how to think about financing. Planners were really at the heart of our plan and understanding how to bring in that social dimension. You see here that we have things like community awareness, community buy-in, government support, and even risk knowledge. All of these things were aspects that we realized on how we needed to do preparedness. How can we make people understand what was available or not? The number one feedback that actually we started hearing from planners themselves was, I've heard a lot about planning, taking up the concept of resilience. I've heard there are resources out there, but now tell me what to do with all of it. So we really focused on creating a what to do framework. We created 4 major dimensions: people, place, infrastructure, and economy. We also created a resilience planning method, and this was for any community in Michigan to go through. It really focuses on the first step, building awareness and capacity in the community. So really working on engagement, on empowerment of staff, making sure that they feel prepared and are ready to handle complex issues, but also then connecting to other resources for financial purposes as well. Assessing vulnerabilities, understanding what shocks any community was going to be susceptible to was a strong part of the second phase, whereas setting priorities then, understanding which sort of area of vulnerability you needed to attack first was definitely number 3. 4 was about taking action, and 5 is really about creating a circular process out of this. A big takeaway that we had is that resilience is not a stagnant or linear process, despite my linear graph here. It truly was a circular process. As soon as you've gone through understanding where your vulnerabilities are and where your opportunities laid, a lot of this really involves setting up future frameworks to collect data so that communities could track, monitor, and revise their performance. This is my favorite output. I'm sure to many of you, this just looks like a bunch of teeny tiny writing on a very small graph. But actually what you'll see is within these 4 subjects that we laid out, we then sent goals of what they meant. So for instance, in the place area, we focused on air quality, green infrastructure, biodiversity, urban heat islands. There's 4 other areas that fall into place as well too, but each of these areas are subcategorized into this. The planning tool that we developed helps planners understand what you can look for, how you can measure these things, what open source data and evaluation sources are there, and even what links you could go to make sure that you could access that data. It was quite overwhelming whenever we first realized just the variety of tools that there were available from a national, local, and even state level perspective. So this library, I think, is the most useful thing that came out of the plan. Of course, it's different for each state, if you will, but a lot of these resources are federal. The website actually goes live in a couple of weeks. I have it at the end of my slides, but I encourage you, if you ever need it and are wondering how to evaluate certain things, there's some really great links in there that'll take you directly to the data resources. Now, shifting gears to the city level, the Las Vegas master plan. This one is really, I think, good to focus on because it is indeed a master plan. It is needed to be presented to the Planning Commission. It was adopted last year, and it's very important that for the city of Las Vegas, that resilience was a center key to this. What's important, I think, as we go through this case study is we're really also going to focus on understanding how these climate issues connected directly to the social issues again, but in a little bit more concrete of a manner. Education, crime and safety, homelessness, open space preservation, water availability, and drought were really at the central concepts of what we defined as the major shocks to the city of Las Vegas. A big part of this plan too was understanding the future and how Vegas was going to look. What was really interesting about Las Vegas now is that there actually is a strong awareness of how constrained future growth conditions are. While many of us in Michigan, Ohio, non-coastal areas, if you will, are quite used to being able to just plan for future growth and development, the one thing that the entire region of Las Vegas was aware of was that they were going to need to be planning for a future with probably less access to resources, specifically to water. Knowing from an economic development perspective that they were headed towards the development of 300,000 new residents by 2050, they also needed to create new parks, they needed to create new housing units, and they also needed to create new commercial space. The resilience aspect of this plan really focused on actually setting standards that already existed in commercial spaces for water conservation, and also connecting that to the residential sector and to the open space sector. The equity portion of this plan really came into the component of we had to keep everything very strong, very affordable, if you will. In the city of Las Vegas, and I'll touch on this on my next slide, there's already restrictions and also guidelines and incentives on how commercial development can stay really efficient in terms of both water and energy. However, whenever you get into the residential sector, there's pretty much no sustainable design guidelines. Design guidelines are even a little bit empty-handed depending on which neighborhood of the city that you're in. And whenever it came to really looking at the equity proportions of Las Vegas, understanding that different portions of the city had really different divisions in terms of wealth, it then became really important for us to understand, okay, as we're setting these conservation measures, we need to do so in a way that we make sure that we don't increase what we call the utility income burden, or the amount of utility bills that, the amount of your income that's spent on utility bills per month, but also making sure that we kept a strong understanding too on not penalizing people for having things like yards, etc. We know that a key part to sort of living an easy life, if you will, is also having wonderful access to green space. So we wanted to make sure that all residents kind of kept an equal opportunity and weren't penalized just because of the type of environment they lived within. So it was really setting guidelines for sustainability within the master plan itself. It's a good example of how data that existed from external resources to the city really helped us. The heart of our plan is something that planners do all the time, right? We use GIS data to really understand current Las Vegas conditions and how future conditions were going to look. But one thing that we were really able to do is create a strong understanding of how future build and future land use changes were going to be affected, specifically through data that came from the Regional Water Authority. As you'll notice from the upper sort of right-hand side of this chart, you'll see that this is the Regional Southwest Nevada water consumption chart. It's going on a downward trend. So we were really tasked with understanding how that growth again could continue maintaining this trend. Whenever we think about the planning decisions that we made, we did zoom in and think, okay, what are the metrics of impact that we can help to measure in terms of land use changes, and how can we make sure that these become more sustainable? Instead of just measuring square foot or square acreage in terms of growth, square foot of new development, we actually attached what we called metrics for change within each one of these land use decisions. We looked at water, car ownership, open space metrics, jobs, commute time, and even mobility accessibility to make sure as we were looking at how new areas could develop, as we were going through scenario planning of those different place types increasing, how would water consumption, car ownership, open space, etc., each be affected? What this let us do is actually do multi-factor decision making directly alongside the city. If you're a planner and the chart on the left doesn't mean anything to you, then the number one takeaway I think from my presentation is a Sankey diagram is a wonderful tool. Let's use them all over the place. If you have a data person at your company or even someone who just uses Excel well, make them do this for you. Get utility data, get publicly available data, and really understand where that delta T is in between supply and demand in the future. Whenever we looked and developed our Sankey diagrams, where water was going to be going from this future case scenario, it let us zoom into really three things that kind of show up here quite clearly. Whenever looking at that new residential builds specifically, we saw that toilets, showers, sinks, and even evaporation were a really key part to wasting water. So whenever we zoomed in to think about how to create great residential environments that were sustainable, we were able to recommend to the city that something that came out for new build was efficient water fixtures. It was also making sure that we gave design guidelines for the types of open space consideration, the types of native plant species that would be able to not only consume less water, but be able to help protect against evaporation rates in places that were experiencing urban heat islands. So I'm gonna skip ahead to the next one actually. Here's what this all looks like when you take all of that data and you zoom it into place, if you will. It's great to have a future understanding, but we needed to know what this looked like in the future as well too. So we took GIS layers and really just tried to understand, okay, in 2050, if we take all of these data layers and almost create hotspots out of them, what starts to happen? As you started to see, you kind of see development happening across the city in light blue, but then there's two areas that we called concern areas. Red were extremely high in environmental impact, if you will, and the orange areas were high in sort of negative equity impact. So we knew in focusing on these districts actually that as we looked about developing these neighborhoods actually were going to be key to doing two things. One, keeping affordability for housing units really at the center point of the master plan itself, but also two, and really looking concretely at how the areas that were red also could be protected from urban heat island. We came up with 3 recommendations from the residential side. We were able to propose things on design on the types of single family homes as compared to multi-level. Something that we discovered is actually when you looked at sort of the mid-story build of between like 5 and 9 floors, they were actually more efficient for water use. So a big recommendation was sort of figuring out how can we also shift from how we think about housing in Las Vegas. And of course, as I said, the yard and the open space was really at the center point of the plan. The exciting thing from this, as you can see, is the city of Las Vegas is huge. Whenever we were given all of this data, it was really hard to think about how can we make change that really help to capture and prepare the community. And just by taking those data layers and thinking it and taking it all the way down to the block level, we were really able to make decisions that came all the way down to a residential home and help give advice on how those homes could actually help to make a difference. And that was a really rewarding thing to be able to do. The last case study that I'm going to focus on today is Duquesne Light's electrification strategy. This is one of my pet projects. It's been absolutely so fun to work with, and it's also a weird one for planners. It's quite rare that utilities want to work alongside planners to achieve public goals. So I felt really lucky that our utility here really wanted to work directly hand in hand with our city to really understand how they could create a neighborhood of innovation that also kept energy also affordable for the local community residents, but also created a warm and welcoming environment. The level of data analysis that we use in here is also much different than I think traditional planning levels take into place. We used a lot of parametric and climate data itself to sort of think about how climate and weather were really impacting the place that we were going to be planning around. We took more of a design focus here, and I think what that let us do is also understand really and visualize strong the spatial context that the community we were working with was going to develop within. The heart of this is actually a district level plan. So if we think of MEDC as a state level plan that needed to influence cities, if we think of the Las Vegas plan as a city plan that needed to kind of get down into the neighborhood level, Duquesne Light was how can we take the neighborhood level and the city level agreements and drill this down really into a district level. As you can see, one of the big theory things that come across very strongly from Pittsburgh is this focus on equity as well and maintaining our equity indicators. As you go through the planning process in Pittsburgh, It's very important for us to make sure and to show our planning commission here that we're hitting aspects like housing affordability and sustainability, that we're giving thoughts on neighborhood composition and opportunity, and that we're also thinking about things like childhood health and well-being. Overall, this means development for development's sake is not necessarily something we can do. So to be able to pass for new development, what you have to do in Pittsburgh is really show how you've translated that sort of climate resilience directly into your plan. Just a quick reminder too of the utility income burden and how much it really does hit members of our community. In Pittsburgh, we're actually a city that at the time faced some of the highest energy utility income burden rates in the nation. Considering part of this neighborhood plan really focused on affordable housing too, it was really important for us to ensure as we were developing a climate resilient community here, as we were developing an innovation zone, that it wasn't going to do so in a manner that penalized the residents and that it didn't create further opportunities for gentrification. It was really important for us to retain the identity of this neighborhood and to really make sure that we created an innovation ecosystem that was as much socially uplifting as it was resilient uplifting. One thing that happened in the neighborhood we designed around is that there's tons of power outages here too. So it wasn't just thinking about how you could work with the local utility and its existing framework. It was also really thinking about how we can incorporate new technologies to make sure that the communities had more resilient power supplies, specifically in the face of an increased storm frequency. Mitigation also came in pretty strongly as part of this plan. We had to hit the 2030 district goals. So each and every building we created not only had to be resilient, but also had to be sustainable in the long term. One thing that we really had to also consider is when we looked at the site specifically, we also, it was quite high up with a southeastern exposure on a hillside. So when we look at this community, we actually saw that the average future daily temperature max was increasing quite drastically. The first thing we did is work with the utility from kind of a broad master planning perspective to really understand what types of technologies the utility had to use and could deploy within a neighborhood. And we then had to think about how to quantify those sorts of reductions that these technologies could make, if you will. We had all of the utility data left, which meant we could understand how the city itself as a unit was performing in terms of energy consumption. From then understanding the efficiencies of new technologies, we were able to focus on how to reduce that consumption. And all that sounds quite, I guess, technology based. Each of these things are actually aspects that the built environment can come to embody. These were rooftop PV, electrified residential heating, electrified commercial heating, and even looking at things like electric vehicles on site. Understanding that each of these things could help the site itself to not only build resistance, so that's reduce power outages time, but also help to reduce that utility income burden and also reducing the on-site pollution measures, if you will, in particular PM 2.5. What we realized is layering all these things together could also then spatially help us understand where we needed to make change the most in the community. We took these kind of 3 layers of data, power data, energy use consumption, and then different layers of socioeconomic development and created those same heat maps. This let us really zoom in and figure out what neighborhoods we wanted to look at. The fun part about Duquesne Light too is focusing on new concepts of designs. I think a lot of us across the country are really dealing with a lot of power outages, in particular from extreme weather events. And we, at the center point of our plan, was also thinking about how we could ingrain microgrids within the broader DLC grid itself. Microgrids is something I'm going to pause on for a second because as a planner, I think it's something, especially if you tend to do any sort of work in the West Coast or even in any coastal region, it's a term that is starting to explode, if you will, but it can actually mean a variety of things. A microgrid can be a fully functioning and independent power grid. It can actually just mean the integration of on-site resources, things like solar power supplies and battery storages, and things that are net metered to operate independently from a financial, not yet technical perspective. But at the same time, it can also just refer to a backup generation system, things like a diesel generator, uninterrupted power sources. Or on the light-hand side, it can actually refer to just a bunch of distributed energy resources that are brought together virtually and are operated in that manner. So microgrids is also, as annoying as it is to say that resilience is a concept that seems to fluctuate in definition, microgrid is equally a concept that seems to fluctuate with definition. In this instance, we use it to mean two things. How could we ingrain on-site solar, backup battery storage, and new distributed technologies to reduce energy use intensity in the built environment? And two, how could we do so in a manner that helped keep power supplies more affordable, especially considering since solar is a little bit cheaper than your standard electricity rates? How can we combine all of these things within a functioning ecosystem? The heart of our strategy actually ended up being taking a bunch of parametric data that came from TMY3 data. This is your typical meteorological year data, and juxtaposing it onto the built environment. So from just a traditional planning perspective, right, we came across the development that was likely to happen within this district level. Instead of just putting our blocks down and kind of coming up with, aesthetic purposes as to what these blocks needed to look like, or the different developments needed to look like for financial purposes or even social purposes, we looked at how they could perform an environmental service as well too. Thinking that solar needed to be ingrained on site, we looked and took that typical solar data and mapped it onto the buildings so that we could understand at what angle of rooftop PV generation could be optimized, but also looked at things where like natural ventilation and even passive design of windows could be used to help keep down energy use intensity. From a planning perspective, resilience really came down into our design development standards here. We didn't call them site design guidelines because they went a bit farther in requiring developers to almost comply or be incentivized, if you will, to work with electrification standards for new build, but also to agree into having orientation more dictated by design. It was really exciting to see what erupted here. Plans for a new parking garage, if you will, included PV systems and also new batteries. We looked at window systems, depending on which type of environment you were going to be building. We're able to keep on new fins and sort of shading devices. And then we looked specifically at the affordability component all the way on the right to make sure that actually the affordability wasn't just put in certain sections of the building that was less aesthetically pleasing. We looked at actually how we could make sure that all the residents were paying the same amount for their energy bills, but were also kept the same wonderful views and access to things like mobility and transport from the site as they could. At the end of the day, these are some examples of things that started to show up. You can see kind of the plan for buildings starting to incorporate things like solar, lighting controls, window shading, EV charging, HVAC even, but even batteries. I was very excited that we even, the utility is going to let us spray paint the battery, if you will, to make sure that it looks like a piece of local art that's going to be installed there. But that you can see actually, like it's zooming in on some of the housing installations, each rooftop is going to be actually built with solar. So we're really excited to see what went forward. What's exciting, I think, about resilience is actually when you come together and you think about things, how like stormwater management, how really these backup power systems all tend to operate. It doesn't just have to be boring for communities, but it can also be really exciting and aesthetically pleasing. The top left-hand image is actually a rendering of what happens if all of the lights go out on one of the buildings on site. You can see that solar power technologies and even the battery storage system was set up to keep the outside lighting well lit at night. On the right hand side, you can see actually how the building's use of mass timber and even things like the on-site solar systems, if you will, but could start to really reflect a sense of a bit more welcoming nature within the buildings themselves. And whenever we laid everything down actually and made sure that we kept really strong attention to a hazard perspective, how can people evacuate all of these perspectives? How can we make sure that roads are easy to get through? And how can we also make sure that there's a safe area for the community? It all came together actually in a really welcoming, open manner as well. So it was exciting to plan for the unexpected, but to make sure that the unexpected was also going to be able to be used 100% of the time. So that concludes our presentation. I have slides with anyone you want to contact at each one of those plans to see how to get more information. But otherwise, I'm always here to help give resources to planners, especially when it comes to things like integrating data or finding a data set that you want to use to solve a specific problem for a city or even a district neighborhood.
Okay, wonderful. Well, folks, if you have questions, again, please type them in that questions box and we'll see if we can get to them. The first question that we're going to take care of here, this is for you, Katrina. There were a couple of these. People want to know, what is the name of this diagram that you were using in Excel? The Sankey.
Yeah, a Sankey diagram. So I'll even type.
Can you go into that?
Yeah, sure. It's SANKEY. Do you want me to? Did they just ask what it was called, or do you need to talk about it?
Oh, I'm sorry. Talk about it. What can you go
sure.
into it a little bit more? What is it?
Yeah, sure. So Sankey diagram is literally just a diagram that captures the direct interaction between supply and demand. So for the built environment, or even for any type of spatial environment, a neighborhood, however you want to do it, land use, you can use it for open space as well. What you do is on the left-hand side, you incorporate your inputs are going to be supply side, where my water's coming from. It can be energy, waste. You can use it for anything, income. Even if you want, this is my sources of supply. What you then do on the right-hand side is you sort of line up and measure what you want your anticipated outputs to be. So what are the things that are going to make up my demand side component? So just focusing on water, if you break it down into commercial buildings, residential buildings, and industrial purposes, right? You can break it down into toilets, into water fixtures, into all sorts of nitty-gritty details. And by assigning sorts of levels of efficiency, if you will, you can cause like a 1 or a 2. It'll literally help you understand just what the interaction between that supply and demand and how it gets broken up with. I sometimes stop with percentages. So I'll be like, commercial build is I need it to take up 30%. So from a resilience perspective, especially when you have goals within communities, if you know that you need residential units to decrease by 20% of consumption, if you will, you can take your current residential consumption minus 20% from that. And what'll show up actually on the right-hand side is actually the measures that you need to achieve to break that down.
There we go. Didn't want to unmute me. Thank you. This next question, let's start with you, Caroline, and go from there. Where can we go online to find peer-reviewed studies that validate that CO2 is one of the primary elements causing climate change? Where can we go to find that basic claim?
You're breaking up a little bit, but are you asking like where can we go to get peer-reviewed climate data?
Well, specifically validating that CO2 is one of the primary elements causing climate change.
Oh, so I talked a little bit about the IPCC's AR6. I think that's a good resource. That would probably be the one that I would start with. Kelly, Katrina, that's a little bit more your space if you wanted to go there.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right with that resource. The Stern review, which was completed in 2014, updated in 2016, goes through the over 10,000 published articles actually that have been published on the impacts of CO2 as a contributor to climate change, dating actually back to 1940s. So there's a wealth of information there. Google Scholars are also a great tool. If you ever need to go for it, pick the latest year, make sure you get the author actually who has a high impact rating score. But I think one that I really look at too that always help people are ones that your local universities have published. I feel like working in communities, they tend to listen sometimes to professors that make the most sense within your community. if you will. And most of them have either an atmospheric science department, an energy resource center, or something like that. The only place I encourage you not to go is anything published, no offense to them, by chemical engineers, because they tend to be the biggest naysayers.
Thank you. And I apologize if my internet is wonky. Our ice storm is picking back up again, and so the weather is not ideal outside. So I'm on the, I'm on the whim of my internet right now. Next question: what's rooftop PV?
Sure. So these are solar panels that go right on top of your house or residential system, if you will. It just stands for photovoltaic. Sorry.
Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and ask this question slightly off topic, but it kind of pertains. Any thoughts on promoting microgrids, individual solar and battery per unit versus promoting solar farms and, kind of getting your offset from a solar farm, but actually having a unit or a microgrid?
Do you want me to do this one again? I don't mind, but I feel like, okay. And Caroline, I feel like you probably, especially from working in Honolulu, might have insights on this as well too. But for me, I think it heavily depends on location. So for places in where the grid is decarbonizing a little bit slowly, you want both, right? I mean, ideally in this situation, you do want those mass resources, especially from an equity perspective. Large-scale solar developments actually help to keep renewable resources available to everyone who's bought into the grid. But that being said, if you're in a rural community where you tend to have a weak grid tie and you're going to need to be expanding new infrastructure lines, sometimes it can make sense to think about microgrids as well. Most of the work that I did on microgrids actually started when I worked with the Canadian government on the islands that are off the northeast coast of Canada. And there it just made sense. So like if you're in Michigan, Ohio, anything in the upper sort of regions there, microgrids might make more sense just compared to the ease of being able to access land or not. So there's a variety of factors, but the geek in me wants to say do everything, like do both of them, but probably the equitable side of me is like, let's focus on large scale solar deployment first. Does that sound right, Caroline?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let's talk equity for a moment. I'm looking for a good question on these equities. There's quite a few of them, which is good. Let's discuss, okay, can you discuss utility income burden a little more? Is this intended to be an equity consideration to inform climate planning? Let's deep dive a little bit into this.
Sure. So utility income burden is a metric of where it's simply total bills that you pay towards utility that's divided into your total portion of income. So you want to get a fraction of how much of my bills for a resident are going toward, or how much of my income, excuse me, is going towards utility bills per month. It's a useful metric for measuring equity, if you will. So for instance, for people of lower income levels, it tends to happen that if you're living in places that are not energy efficient, that are not even water resource efficient, if you will, you end up paying for that efficiency more just because it's passed on to you. You don't tend, especially as a renter, not to have control over those decisions on how your HVAC or your heating and cooling, systems are performing. So for us, using the utility income burden can be a measurement in drawing comparisons between how much homeowners versus renters especially pay, so that we can really think about how to force especially commercial development owners or even residential owners to upgrade their systems a bit more. But it can also help you make that decision that you just asked about microgrids or like rooftop PV, which is from a microgrid perspective, there can be a financial incentive to do so. Instead of talking about a microgrid that operates strictly off of wires, but from a virtual perspective, what we're starting to see from community integrated solar developments or just cooperatives. Some people tend to call these now virtual microgrids, if you will, and those offer, especially with the cost of solar where they are now, they can offer more financially attractive reasons to make then smarter, more efficient, less carbon intensive decisions when it comes to energy.
Thank you. All right, we got a bunch of planners on the line. Let's dive a little bit deeper into specific action that we as planners can take. I'll start with you, Caroline. You mentioned climate science being integrated into more traditional planning mechanisms like comp planning, capital improvement planning. Can you expand on what communities are doing?
Sure. So, I mean, like I mentioned in my presentation, I think they're doing it in a lot of different spaces. So, you know, a master plan that wasn't really considering climate adaptation or climate mitigation is now wanting to look at that, a master plan or a comprehensive plan. And I think that it creates a really interesting dynamic on how does that sort of not just bolt on to those plans, but really bake in and integrate in. I also think it's important, like there's a huge range in what communities are doing on whether it's like codified into what they're doing or it's just sort of considered. And that is where I think the rubber will meet the road a little bit. So it's one thing to, you know, if you think about the permitting process or the project development process to say, okay, like this project's kind of going through this approval process and considering climate, but it's not, you know, maybe there's leeway there because they can get a variance or it's not required, it's just a consideration. So I think communities have to be a little bit careful if they really want things to have an impact. You've got to make sure that there's like teeth and regulation there.
And to that, let's dive in a little bit. Do you have any suggestions or best practices that we can lead our attendees to that specifically address energy standards and how they're incorporated in codes, in zoning codes, building codes? Do you have any case studies, best practices where we can turn to, or maybe even like, I don't even know, Carla, maybe you know, PAS reports or any really good examples of how to integrate energy standards into code?
Energy standards going to be all Katrina.
I have 3 sneaky ways, and I say sneaky because not nobody, but very few people know how to do it, and you can do it because a lot of them don't know what it means. So I'm excited about this question. My favorite way, one, getting communities to sign up for 2030 districts. It's incentive based, nobody gets angry. My favorite way though is sneaking in code requirements on RFPs specific for developers, or putting in code requirements as part of putting them within master plans as part of sustainable design guidelines. 2 big things can help you. One, requiring no fossil fuel combustion on site. If people are squeamish at that, a lot of times if you say electrification, people don't know what that means, which is what that means. So if you say that, that can also get you through. And then lastly, pointing to the latest building code updates. So a lot of building codes for cities are kept at what we call ASHRAE, which is ASHRAE 90.1, and they tend to operate off of a 2015 basis. If you tend to require the code for a tri-annual update, including most recently 2021, they'll be operating super efficiently.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Let's go back to you, Caroline. You can maybe start on this. Can a community be successful in fighting the effects of climate change if they're only considering either mitigation or adaptation, but not necessarily both?
Yeah, interesting question. So it's a little bit like, what are their goals and how do they want to be successful? So climate mitigation is going to be like, what are they doing to reduce those greenhouse gases and kind of their carbon footprint? The adaptation side is, okay, how do we, you know, take all of our existing infrastructure and buildings, et cetera, in future, of course, and have them be able to better absorb all the shocks and stressors that are coming their way from climate. So, I mean, my opinion is yes, as long as it's aligned with their goals, but I think they can really optimize it and be part of the solution if they're kind of optimizing both.
I like this question. Okay, what are the most effective accelerants to building resilience at the community level? What ingredients or circumstances can make these transitions occur more quickly?
I mean, funding always helps. You know, there's a few things, right? Like, I mean, there's definitely money. You've got to have like political will and capacity to do it. Kind of to the question I was talking about or answering earlier, like a lot of communities have intent, but it's not really required. So you're not like, that's not going to help you. You need to really have some teeth in what you're doing in order to like make this stuff happen faster. Those are the ones that are coming to mind right off the top of my head. I don't know, Katrina, you had others?
No, I think that was brilliantly worded, and it also made me laugh. So thanks for that. I totally agree. But I think the only thing
money helps.
Yeah, money super helps. But I think the only thing that, Caroline, I don't know what you think. I think it's so important to be nuanced, which each community needs when you're doing it at the local level. It's so different for everyone. So I think really listening is such a key part to combine with also your data investigation, understanding where your vulnerabilities are, but hearing even what has happened and what people like feel that they need to be addressed is sometimes so left out of the really geeky science stuff that we do. And I think it makes it easier to prioritize if you can hear sometimes what people need to feel better about going about their daily lives.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, you want us to getting the small wins up front so you can start to show progress and get that momentum going, I think is a really it's a good way to build the momentum and be able to get things going faster. It can feel like you are stuck in the planning process and not actually, you know, driving and making a difference if you are just planning and don't start to get into the implementation side of it.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Okay, so not everyone works in a big city. I know we reference a lot of larger cities. So can we talk for a moment about our exurbs and our rural areas? Do we have any rural plans that can be referenced, or, you know, county regional type plans, you know, in more rural areas?
So I know right now in Michigan, they're going through, Wayne County is just starting theirs. It's been tricky though, to be blunt. I mean, I think a lot of cities, maybe because there's money there, or maybe just because there's more people in them, have recognized vulnerabilities a bit more. I haven't worked with too many rural communities. I've worked with a lot smaller municipalities. We just finished the Royal Oak Climate Action Plan in Michigan, and that's not a big city whatsoever. I did my hometown here in Pittsburgh, which is only like 27,000 people. But to be honest, resilience within rural areas, I think I personally haven't experienced many champions of resilience necessarily laying within those areas. Maybe just because the people feel naturally resilient or already have those measures baked in because they're more susceptible to natural elements. But my work tends to be quite urban centric.
Yeah, I find in the rural communities, which because they're smaller, like their capability, or it's not their capability, it's their capacity is really stretched. So to be able to take on, you know, another project, there usually has to be some sort of impetus or catalyst there. We've worked with a few, and we're currently working with one in Southwest Virginia, and it's climate adaptation. It's not the mitigation side, but you know, they're in the position that they're in because they were subject to some very severe floods over the past few years. And also, the state of Virginia had a grant program that allowed them to get a grant. But even having those resources, having the political will, having kind of the catalyst of the disasters and all of that, I think it's a challenge for those communities to be able to take these on. So, I mean, I do think that that's something that we're as a field cognizant of and trying to help. Like, for example, BRIC provides, sometimes some parts of their grant program are set aside for, the smaller disadvantaged communities, but yeah, I can't think of one that would be a great go-to right off the top of my head. Sorry about that.
Katrina, can you discuss standards for retrofitting existing neighborhoods as well as new construction?
Yeah, sure. So I think that a tricky thing that we all face as planners is actually that standards tend not to be updated sometimes as much as communities need or want them to be when faced with new development, right? And retrofitting is definitely, I think, the hardest thing to tackle. And I want to be specific by time period here. If you're retrofitting a building that is, let's say, we'll call it pre-1980s, if you will, there's an incentive to think about making a switch to a more efficient system just for financial purposes out the gate. It doesn't have to be climate purposes or anything, but the main difference is like you're only going to be operating around 60% efficiency. The tricky part of where you'd want that financial funding that Caroline talked about to incentivize switching existing retrofitting is any build that's going to be like 1990s onward, just because those mechanical systems within the buildings or within infrastructure of the neighborhoods even are still going to be within their normal life cycle. It's still, they're coming up on the end, like they probably got another 8 years out of them. But I think the real encouraging thing that you want to say, that you want to communicate to your stakeholders, is that as planners, we're often not talking about the next 1 or 2 years, right? We're laying out the next 10 years of development. So you want to be asking the question for the community, I think, and for your city governments, to the developer especially, if the best thing we could do for any community right now is to create a 1 in 100 year building, right? A building that's going to last for 100 years. So if we're thinking about creating that, what are the systems that I can make last as long as possible? Is it the system you have today? If so, if you're going to switch it out within 5 years, but you're going to still own this for 20, does that make sense? So I think the best thing that planners can do actually is almost push back on the financial people, because to be honest, it's likely that those standards for having to retrofit are not going to be there.
Thank you. Going back to baking resiliency in our codes, what about the resilience overlay zoning districts? Have you worked with them? How effective are they? How many communities are utilizing them? Have you heard of them? Can you talk a little bit more about them?
I can speak a little bit to that. So, we have resilience districts. One that we worked with at Stantec is the Gentilly district in New Orleans. And there are certainly other ones as well. What I like about them is, there's a lot of flexibility there. So there's different needs within a resilience district or within a particular area on like what you would do with that. So you have to first kind of ask yourself, like, well, what are we trying to be resilient to? Is it a, stormwater flooding issue? Is it, a combination of things, and put that in there. But I think what's great about the resilience district is they do get into that triple bottom line approach. So it's not just like, well, let's fix the flooding issue. It's okay, how do we take this overlay district and be able to mitigate the hazard, but also enhance the community? So in Gentilly, for example, we really made that water that was a threat. We turned it into like a recreational access, and there's parks that then could flood, and there's economic development because it really opened up the existing water that was kind of there permanently in order to enhance the community at large.
Thank you. Our last question, I left this one for last. How would you compare the difficulty, impact, importance of engineered solutions like tech upgrades, system changes, new rules, and behavior-based solutions? So people changing their routines, their habits, their decision-making for building resilience. So again, how are we comparing the engineered solutions versus behavior-based solutions? Does it really require both? Are they sort of on an even keel? Is there one that's more effective than the other? If you could just take a moment to think about that and give your thoughts.
I'm happy to start this actually because I think they're equally important. If anything, I think behavior might be a bit more important, if I'm honest. One of the favorite things I learned in my PhD was actually one of the most financially effective ways that the European Union reduced their carbon was through eco-labels. So encouraging just the carbon footprinting on all of the materials, telling people to recycle this more and more. But I think when we think that systems age and are used, actually their consumption only depends on how much people actually interact them. The more that you can encourage people to be sustainable, then the less we even need those systems. And, you know, perhaps I'm like an uber environmentalist at my heart, but removing stress on systems, especially from a resilience standpoint, is the easiest way to make sure that your systems are going to be able to have longevity. So I actually think if I was even giving a ratio, I personally feel like, you know, 60% behavioral, 40% systems, but the answer should always be integrated design. I think, but honestly, people are the most important factor.
Yeah, I mean, if there's not will to get it done, it's probably not going to happen. It certainly won't happen fast. So I definitely think behavioral change is huge to it.
Okay. Well, thank you. So that's what we're leaving with today. That's our sort of nugget of wisdom today, is that people have to be on board for the system to work properly. So thanks to our panelists today, for Caroline and Katrina, and of course our host Carla, who's representing the Sustainable Communities Division. We are recording this session. We'll post it up on our YouTube channel. Last week's introductory session to this topic is up on our YouTube channel as well. Just head over to YouTube and search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. We have, by the way, well over 350 videos or session recordings there for you to view. Don't forget to log those CM credits, and don't forget to register for all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So thanks to you all for joining us today. We had a really robust group. We had some great speakers, lots of good questions, and look forward to our next edition in this Sustainability and Resiliency series. So everyone have a great weekend and stay safe. We'll talk next time.